What's up, everyone? Tyler Tamboline here, aka Toe Tag and Tambo, back for the Sunday edition of Wildcard Weekend. We had a wild one yesterday in itself, a couple zeros out there to disappoint us all, but we're going to redeem ourselves here. Got my man Grant on with me, the fireball drinking retired man, onto the wine connoisseur. What's going on, Grant? What's happening?
Not a whole lot. Yeah, I definitely stumbled into a few of those zeros yesterday. It was way over the field on Rojo. And the sad thing is, like, I had Gibson. And I'm like, how do I change my lineup up? Like, I don't like Henneke starting in there. I think that gives him a little bit of a downgrade. I don't know if this game will stay close anymore. And so switched to Rojo, and that, I think that ended up costing me cashing. I think I was like 5 points away from cashing with Rojo in my lineup. So, yeah, a little bit disappointed to say the least.
Yeah, it's the way it goes. You can make or break yourselves pretty easily on these 3-game slates. We deal with it Thanksgiving, all the playoff slates leading up this year with COVID and things like that, different opportunities we've had to play these where you get the advantage of one game after the other, and then you have to make all these late swap decisions as the day goes on. So I think, before we get started, guys, we appreciate the support. Producer Devin's going to drop the link in there. Get yourself $10 off to get started on everything we're going to go through here today. And then also smash the like button, subscribe. Grant and I are going to do our best to get through this slate. And Grant, before we get into, position by position, all that, I think this slate is a lot different than yesterday in a sense where a little bit more tricky, a little bit more decisions to be made. Obviously at quarterback, I think we've got a guy like Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson that people all want to go to again. But beyond that, there's a lot of plays that are in play for me. So we'll try and work our way through it. What's your thoughts overall grand scheme on this slate?
It's going to definitely be a higher scoring slate. We have 4 teams over a 25 implied team total. Yesterday, it was an interesting slate, and there was definitely a few spots that really stood out. Obviously, Josh Allen, Diggs, and then a little bit in the later game with some of Tom Brady's wide receivers. But this slate is definitely going to be high scoring. I know there's certain chalk that I am absolutely 100% just locking in. It's that simple. Michael Thomas, I think, is the one guy that just clearly underpriced, very few avenues where he doesn't end up hitting value. Worth eating the chalk there because there's going to be, 4 guys over 30% owned or 6 guys over 30% owned. So, you just pick and choose where you want to eat chalk, and this is a perfect spot to really correlate correctly. We'll get into it, but there's 2 running backs that are going to be over 40% owned who direct pivots off of them have a massive negative correlation on their or positive correlation on their fantasy value. So swapping off of them to the other things in the game is just a smart thing to do.
Yeah, we can start there. Actually, I love that call, and I think I know exactly where you're going with it. So we typically start at the running back position. Yesterday, I switched it up, went with quarterback just because it's a shorter slate, but I think we'll go there because it is a little bit more of an interesting dynamic on the slate. And the guys you're talking about are at the top here. Alvin Kamara, regardless of COVID, regardless of practicing from home on his computer screen and whatnot, at 51%, people are still definitely in on that. And then Derrick Henry, of course, on a tear all the way up until now, getting to go against the Ravens here. We'll see what happens, but still looking to be somewhere around that 50% range. And even David Montgomery has crept up. But just talk to me about these 3 chalk running backs, maybe the 2 you were mentioning, and then your slate dynamics, how you're going to go against that or what your play is there.
So the biggest thing is going to be Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is the obvious guy where you either play him because he's just doesn't make any sense. He's just ridiculous, especially at this point in the year. During playoffs last year, he just crushed. There's a lot of different ways this game can go, though. Baltimore is a very good team, and they have a propensity going up against other good teams to kind of lose it. But Tennessee defense is not great. Like Baltimore has put up massive outings against bad defenses all season long. I think they have the largest point differential in the entire league so far this season, even though they barely made it into the playoffs. So bad teams they've ended up blowing out. I don't think that ends up happening here, but Baltimore is definitely a team that can end up putting up 40 points. So it's just a perfect spot to kind of correlate playing Derrick Henry and bringing it back with guys over on the Baltimore side. Specifically, Lamar Jackson is the guy that I'm going to have in pretty much all my Derrick Henry lineups. Pair Lamar with either Hollywood, Andrews, or even Boykin if you really want to go a little bit off the board. And then if I'm not playing Derrick Henry in my lineup, then it's going to be a Tennessee stack. It's going to be Tannehill. It's going to be Davis or Jonnu or A.J. Brown or multiple of them. Because the way that Derrick Henry doesn't end up hitting value is if he doesn't end up getting touchdowns. He's very touchdown dependent because he doesn't get a ton of receptions in any given game. I think all season long, the most he had in a single game was 3, and that was week 1. So he's not going to be heavily targeted in the receiving game. He can end up with 140 yards, but if he doesn't end up getting a touchdown, he's not even close to getting value. This is going to be a high-scoring game, so knowing that if Henry doesn't get a touchdown or even 2, that means that A.J. Brown, Davis, and Jonnu are all going to be the guys that end up with touchdowns.
Yeah, and I love that play. When we move over to quarterback, that was certainly something I would have been bringing up. I agree with you 100% there. I think the thing about Henry is this, and you kind of hit on it there in going back and forth with it, but I think as polarizing as it is, it's pretty easy because if you've got one lineup, make a decision. He's in it or not, and that's how you go. If you've got multiple, just build accordingly. And what I mean by that is everything you just said. He's either, the Ravens want to stop him. We know this. They're going to try their absolute best to stop him, but if they don't or they can't, he's going to go off and just do what he always does. So I think, when I'm building with him, I like what you said about having Lamar in there. He's going to set up for a better pace. He's going to set up for that over to get after it. And then you are going to have Lamar, much like last year's playoff game. If everybody remembers correctly, last year, Lamar lost, the Ravens lost, but Lamar had one of his, if not best fantasy games of the season against them because that was the way it set up and the pace was pushed and neither team could stop each team's best running back. I know he's got a QB tag in front of him, but we know he's one of the best running backs in the league. The thing is, that makes perfect sense. On the other side of it, I love what you said there. A.J. Brown, Jonnu Smith, these guys directly go against everything that Henry does. So it's easy to set it up the other way. And then you can use some of these Baltimore guys that we'll get into and maybe help you guys go from there. Again, the great Satan, he's mentioned in there, Lamar and Baltimore running game, controlling the ball. And then where goes Henry with the clock? He's talking about, again, picking your spot, how the game's going to go, and then building your lineup accordingly towards that. What about your thoughts here on Alvin Kamara, just based on the fact that he's the most popular after the news came out? Typically we haven't seen that in other sports where people go back to this. They normally say, oh, maybe this is not, but it's the playoffs. Everyone knows it's win or you're out. So where are you at here with Alvin Kamara at 8.5K?
So Alvin Kamara, I think I'm going to fade. Not entirely, but fade a decent amount here. Like I said, I'm going almost 100% on Michael Thomas. A lot of Kamara's value comes from his receiving game work. Like he was the top guy in the league because they had no one else to throw it to, and Breeze would dump it off to him. I think his receptions per game with Breeze at quarterback and without Michael Thomas in the offense was somewhere around 9 a game. He's just been absolutely crushing most of the season long, and anytime Thomas is not in the offense, that's where he gets most of the receiving work. So Kamara is a guy that I don't want to have in the same lineup as Michael Thomas. There's a very decent chance that both of them end up going off. Like that can absolutely happen. They're the entirety of this offense. It's going to be very short field passes and full point PPR. That's kind of what is going to end up happening. Breeze may throw the ball 40 times during the course of the game. Likely less, but he could do that, and 60 to 70% of them could end up going to both Michael Thomas and Kamara. Like I said, I'm locking in Thomas, so my exposure to Kamara is probably going to be around 20%. I just don't think it's the right move to end up playing him. Problem is you have to figure out who to play at running back after that. If you're not playing Henry in a lineup, it just becomes tough to not play Henry or Kamara because you just have too much money to end up going with. And I don't really want to play Montgomery. I'm not a big fan of James Conner. I'm not a big fan of Chubb. Kareem Hunt is cheap. Dobbins is fine, but like I just have to set up correlation or correlate things correctly. And Kamara and Thomas are going to negatively correlate a ton. And Henry and Tannehill are going to negatively correlate. So that's pretty much what I'm doing right now. Like as we're going along, I've built one lineup over on DK, and that's pretty much it for the Sunday slate. I already built a ton for the Saturday and Sunday slate, so I got all those things set up already. So as we're going along this show, I'm just going to be setting up a whole bunch of different lineups, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, I like it. I think the one that you mentioned, and I know you sort of skipped over him and said, but it just feels a little bit cheap and the ownership's not quite there. I wonder about James Conner because nobody's really talking about him. 25% isn't much when you think about the grand scheme of things. And just depends how they use him. I know Denzel Ward is out for Cleveland. It makes me wonder, if all those receivers are going to be popular, or at least one in every lineup, and Roethlisberger airs one out. You've got a backup cornerback in there, let a little, hold go down, and then you've got Connor lined up for these 1 yard goal line touchdowns. The opportunities are still there. I think he's interesting at 5K. Talk to me about the Cleveland backs, though, on the opposite side of that game. Any love for Chubb or Hunt?
I mean, very little. The problem with Connor here is he's pretty much been all right at the beginning of the season. Obviously, the first time they ended up facing Cleveland, he had 100 yards and he had a touchdown. But he has been great. Pittsburgh's been the worst DVOA running offense in the entire league. He's still pegged at 26%, so I don't really get a huge amount of value from playing him, even though it's 15% less than a lot of these other guys. I would rather go with Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt seems to be getting overlooked here. There's a decent chance that Cleveland is going to be trailing late in the game, and so he's obviously a guy that can get in there for pass game work. He can end up with multiple touchdowns in any given game. I know that Pittsburgh is a tough offense or a tough defense. Clearly, they're the top ranked defense in the league. Yep. Great versus the pass, great versus the run, great versus everything. But they've really trailed off a little bit towards the end of the season, both on the offensive and defensive end. But this is the playoffs. Anything can happen. Cleveland's an offense that can really end up beating any defense. So Hunt's the guy I prefer to Connor. I don't mind. I'm not happy about either of them. I don't mind either of them. It's just a weird slate at running back where the reason why Kamara and Henry are so darn chalky is because they are clearly the best plays here. But Hunt, yeah, definitely a guy that I think you can use in GBPs. Even Chubb, he can still end up with 100 yards rushing in any game. He can get multiple touchdowns. He's had a touchdown in 7 straight games. In one of those, he had multiple touchdowns. He's got close to the most touchdowns on the season, or I don't think he ended up with most touchdowns on the season. But
he's a beast, though, and at 6.7K versus Derrick Henry at 9.2. If you need some savings, I'm not saying he's Derrick Henry here, but it's just if Derrick Henry's trapped or doesn't get there, or maybe in the builds that you use Tannehill and those receivers and that core, then you could get a guy like Chubb in there for much cheaper. You'd still have the money to spend. And like you said, he ends up getting 100 on the ground and sneaks one in. That's plenty of value, almost like a mini Jonathan Taylor from yesterday, where, yeah, he's not the top scoring running back, but he definitely fits in your lineup that still makes sense for an overall solid build with the upside there of more, of course, as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I honestly like Cleveland, I think, the most today. We'll get to that a little bit more when we get to quarterback. But Cleveland, I think, ends up beating Pittsburgh today. I have money on the money line for Cleveland. That's one of my favorite money line bets today is Cleveland. But yeah, it's just Chubb can beat up any offense. He just had 100 yards and a touchdown against Pittsburgh Grand. That was with their B squad. But he can absolutely do that in any given game. It doesn't really matter what the matchup is. They're still going to run the ball a decent amount, although I think they are going to pass the ball a decent amount too in this game. So yeah, Chubb is a guy you can go with, but running back is just so muddled. Everyone's probably projected to be owned about where they should be. Outside of Chubb and Hunt are the two guys that are less owned than they should be. Maybe Dobbins too. But yeah, it's such a weird slate today.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about it, right? That's the good thing here. We're breaking it down for you guys. Producer Devin's doing a great job dropping those inactives in the chat. Just mentioned, Willie Snead active, Mark Ingram and Chris Moore are inactive. So keep note of that. Now we'll get to that. It's a good point to segue over. Before we leave the Cleveland ones, one thing I'll mention quick is I'm not as big, and I know we're going to quarterback in a second with Baker and Roethlisberger. I actually like Roethlisberger a little bit more, but what I was going to say is Kareem Hunt makes for a nice at 4.8K, a nice little secondary stack where you can just put him and Deontay on DraftKings, or you could put him and Claypool, Mapletron on FanDuel where you're looking for those touchdowns and just hope that, Mapletron gets a touchdown. Hunt gets in there for one, and that's a nice little secondary correlation that I don't mind, that I think less people will have. I know they'll have one Pittsburgh receiver likely or something around those terms. Talk to me about Baltimore, though. J.K. Dobbins, little breakout there, the end of the season. Obviously a nice little rookie pickup for the Ravens. And then Gus the Bus Edwards. Our man Eric Bimefor got them all tagged up here as a conviction play. But those guys both can get in there too. And they're, sort of the direct leverage off of Lamar, or you can use them both, right? And just say, I'll take over that goal line with Lamar Jackson and one of the running backs. Where are you going there with the Baltimore guys?
Yeah, so Dobbins obviously has been fantastic for several weeks now, still getting over 10 touches a game, but doesn't get a ton of wide or of receiving work. he can go over 100 yards. He can get a touchdown. He's gotten one in 7 straight games. He's going up against Tennessee. They have a 28.75 implied team total on today's slate. So they're going to run the ball a decent amount. We know that. It's just all about where the touchdowns are going to end up going and where the usage is going to end up going between Dobbins and Edwards. So Edwards is so cheap at 4.4K that it just kind of makes things work a little bit better on a slate where you want to pay up for quite a few guys. So Edwards I'm entirely fine with. And the fact that Eric has him tagged up, that Eric's a guy I trust a ton, so I will now have more exposure to Edwards in my lineups just because he can absolutely get it done in any given matchup. Tennessee's one of the middle of the pack kind of rushing defenses in the league, but this is going to be so rushing centric all over the place that there's a lot of ways that Gus ends up getting there, or Dobbins. I'll obviously put a rule. I'm going to actually throw it in right now. They're at most one between Dobbins and Gus Edwards, although most of the time that's not going to end up in your lineups anyways. But yeah, that's like kind of where they're at. But I'm more on the receiving game. I really like Lamar today, as everyone else does. The ownership's the problem. But I really like Hollywood Brown. We look at his numbers, and he was so forgotten pretty much the entirety of the start of the season, but he's really turned it around over the last 6 weeks. He has 6 touchdowns during that span. He has had less than 6 targets only once. He's averaged close to 7.5 during that span. He's going to be in a matchup going up against the worst pass defense in the league. He's the guy that Lamar trusts the most. Lamar is probably going to end up targeting him about 10 times. Currently over on DK, I wonder if the line's actually moved at all. I bet him to end up with over 3.5 receptions, I want to say. So I think that's a great bet. I think that he's going to end up with 8 targets. He's being targeted often. And sorry, I'm just trying to check the reception prop and see if it moved at all. I don't even know if it's on the board anymore. But yeah, like he's one of my favorite plays. His ownership is a little bit concerning because I know he's going to be 29% owned, but you're going to have a tough time finding a guy that's low owned on the slate because it's only a 3-game slate. So the only real direct pivot from him is going to be Claypool at only 8% less ownership. That's really not doing too much for me. So there's only 1 actual or 2 actual low owned wide receivers that I like on the slate, and both of them are actually cheap. I think we got confirmation right when we started the show that Snead is going to end up playing.
Yeah.
Big field GPPs, like Snead can end up with 2 touchdowns. For some reason, he seems to do it almost every season long. So he's a guy that I'm going to sprinkle into my lineups, probably 10% of them. And I'm not expecting a ton out of him. There's a chance he ends up with 15 to 20 points. There's also a chance that he ends up with 2 points.
Okay, yeah. And what I was going to say, too, just to back it up for a second here with Marquise Brown, Hollywood, is that a couple things on it. You mentioned like 29 seems like a lot, but at the same point, he's cheap at 5.4K. He's actually outside the top 5 in ownership. Most people don't double stack Lamar. So it's going to be Lamar, and let's click over to tight end. Look at the overwhelming ownership is on Mark Andrews. So you just mentioned a couple things. One, I love the Hollywood Brown call. They can find him. He can break a slate in an instant. He can break it at the end. People on the showdown slate a few weeks ago there in the primetime game, the very end of the game, he gets that long bomb touchdown. That's sort of what he can do, and that could happen earlier in this game. Definitely an opportunity there. Secondly, you mentioned Snead. I love that play. That's one of the guys that I was going to be on. Another way to get different with Lamar. And again, and then of course you don't have to stack Lamar. We're just giving you some options for how you would go about that. I think Snead in large field is great, but let's talk about just the, again, outside look overview of everything. Lamar Jackson, 30%. 1, do you think that's right, or could it be higher? 2, how do you relate it, if at all, to yesterday with Josh Allen in comparison to the whole slate and how people are going to be utilizing him?
I don't think it's going to be much higher just because Alvin Kamara and Henry kind of make it tough to play Lamar. Yes, there are a lot of people that don't end up playing him with any other wide receiver. It's fairly common to do. I know I've done it many times before, but there is Andrews, there is Hollywood, both of them can end up playing it, and they're both pegged around 30%. I think that's right about where his ownership is going to lie. The interesting one is Big Bennett, 6.1K getting 20% ownership. I don't know if that's going to end up happening. He hasn't put up a real slate buster. I know that he was facing a little bit of a knee injury. I know they might throw the ball 50 times during the course of this game, but they may end up running the ball a decent amount. Big Ben is probably the guy that I have the least amount of interest in at the QB's position, but Lamar, like you said, heavily owned. I think that's about right at 30% is where he's going to end up with. The difference between yesterday's slate and today's slate, we had 3 games, same exact thing. we didn't know who was going to end up playing or how much they were going to end up playing for the Rams. Like, it could have been Wolford, It could have been Goff. We didn't know that. The Seahawks, Russell Wilson hasn't been the same in a long time. So that's one entire game that we have out. We didn't know if Alex Smith or Heineke was going to play at all. So it just became fairly obvious to take Josh Allen. And also, Phillip Rivers. Does anyone ever really play Phillip Rivers? You don't know who to pair him with. You don't know how to correlate. So we have 4 quarterbacks on the slate that were essentially toss-ups people want to stay away from. And we had 2, one of which was in a great scenario, and the other one was Tom Brady, and still in a decent scenario. And you have multiple different options to pair him up with. Today's slate, we have Roethlisberger. We know 4 guys to pair him up with. We have Baker, who's been a little bit up and down, and people are going to stay away from. He's actually my favorite QB on the slate. We have Breeze, who has a noodle arm. We have Trubisky, who likes playing him. Then we have Tannehill, which is a direct pivot off of Henry, and we have Lamar. So it's not quite the same level, which is why I think Lamar is going to end up around 30% because it is tough to play him. But it's a spot where there's a lot more options than there were yesterday that you can realistically go with.
Yeah, and that's exactly how you put it, is what I would say too. Yesterday, all those backup scenarios here, I know everyone will have their Taysom Hill jokes, but forget that. He's at the QB position. It's, in my opinion, not usable at all. I would just get rid of him completely. If he was at some other position, then sure, but he could vulture some stuff or whatever. But when it comes down to it, like you said yesterday with the Heineke Wolford stuff, no clue knowing it, it just was that much more clear. Even if Lamar, and you can do this when you're building up here, you think he's going to be 35 or 40, you can change it right within lineup HQ for your builds. And if you're using max ownership or something like that, you can see how that shakes out. But I just think it's just too clear, for me, that he's going to be a guy I've got to get overweight on. I mentioned there's so many ways that you can use him, so I'm in on that. The debate's going to happen down here between you and I is Trubisky at 5.3 and Baker Mayfield at 5.4. You said Baker's your favorite. Why don't you just elaborate on that a little bit more, and then we'll get into some of the other options. I mean, I'm in on Tannehill and Breeze. I'll talk about them in a second. Breeze is a little bit scary, but talk to us about Baker and your take there, because that's a bold one. He's the lowest owned of all the quarterbacks that are real on the slate besides Taysom. And then you've got, the Pittsburgh matchup, off and on season for a guy like Baker, but he's bounced back. He got the team in the playoffs. What's your thoughts with him?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is, just look at it. People who game log watch, it doesn't give an accurate picture. So going up against the Jets, who are his wide receivers?
Landry?
No, he had no one. That was the COVID week.
Right. Yeah.
So you take that
Higgins,
out.
Donovan Peoples-Jones. It was, yeah.
Yeah, that was a ridiculous week. Then you have the 2 weeks going up against the Raiders and Houston at home with 60-mile-per-hour winds. He only had 20 and 25 passing attempts. You can't really fully buy into that. So we essentially, without OBJ, have a 6-7 week sample size. During that time, he's had 4 games of over 2 touchdowns, averaged around 300 passing yards per game. One of which also was against Pittsburgh, and that was just a whole weird game because they weren't playing their starters, and so they tried to rush the ball and just not make mistakes. But he had a 4-game stretch where he was just airing the ball out, doing fantastic. I know that Pittsburgh is a very, very tough matchup, but you're getting him priced for that at 5.4K, and you're getting low ownership on a 6-game slate. He absolutely has the ability to go with get 300 passing yards. Landry is a perfect guy to pair with him. Landry has been fantastic since they've been in normal weather games since OBJ has gone out. We look at Jacksonville, Tennessee, Baltimore, the Giants. He had 8+ targets in each of those matchups. He has 8 reception upside. He has 100-yard upside, and he has multiple TD upside. He can crush. But the interesting thing is the other 2 wide receivers, if Baker puts up a 350-yard game with multiple touchdowns, there's so many guys that can end up getting that. Peoples-Jones, big play threat in any given week. We look at his last 4 games, he hasn't gone over 3 targets more than once, but he has the ability to end with a 40-50-yard catch. He's 3.2K. He's 4.5% projected ownership. You have to learn to differentiate, or you have to differentiate yourself a little bit. You can fit both Kamara and Derrick Henry in your lineups, stack up Cleveland, and then play the best plays from the other spots.
Yeah, still fit your Pittsburgh wide receiver in that you want as the run it back, because it's definitely going to happen, and just see what money's left over. I guess you've sold me a little bit here. And the chat says Grant with the hard sell. So I love to see that. I think it's good. I mean, I guess most people, it seems, want to go with Trubisky down in this range at 5.3K, just as the opposite side. My take was that with Breeze, I'm with you. Noodle arm. I was saying it all season. Noodle arm, noodle knees, Mr. Drew Brees. This guy's old. He can't get it done. They didn't want to use him in certain scenarios. Speaking of which, side note, I was surprised they let Phillip Rivers throw that Hail Mary yesterday, and it didn't get there as expected at the end of that game. But good effort on their part. But Breeze is in sort of a similar stance. But we've got guys, not only him at 5.7K, but 8.5K Kamara's underpriced, in my opinion, versus the overall, what we would normally see him at, some of the COVID stuff and things there. But you mentioned locking in Michael Thomas, and I agree. And we're going to get to wide receiver. We're kind of trying to jive these together with talking about these quarterbacks and stacks that can go with them. But those guys can drag Breeze along, right? We've seen it earlier in the season. Now they're healthy. He's got other guys there too. Sanders, Cook. There is opportunity. What are your thoughts on that?
So, like, the biggest thing is before Taysom went into the lineup, I think that the Saints were still like number 3 or number 4 in offensive DVOA. Like, Breeze may not be able to throw the ball downfield, but that isn't playing well to Michael Thomas's game too much. He's mostly a slant, and hopefully he takes it to the house, but mostly based on large volume. Kamara is mostly short and intermediate routes, and Breeze can absolutely make those work. So we know that the volume is going to get there. Interesting enough, yeah. FYI, guys, sign up for Scores and Odds Premium. Go ahead, go do that. Getting picks every single day, giving out winners, although yesterday I did terrible. But right now, like, Michael Thomas's receiving prop was sitting at 70 yards on pretty much every site and 5.5 receptions. And there was a pretty, like, just standard juice on both sides, minus 112 on both sides. His receiving prop has gone all the way up to minus 150 on over 70 yards. And his reception prop is all the way at minus 140 to minus 150 on the over 5.5 receptions. So he's expected to get at least 70 yards. He's expected to get at least 6 receptions in all likelihood. And I think his touchdown prop is minus 120. So his overall median projection is around 6 receptions, 70 yards, and a touchdown. Right there, that's going to end up with 18, 19 points. That's his median. Like, over 50% of the time, I think he's going to end up getting there with the heavy juice on the over. Yeah. So, yeah, Michael Thomas, I'm just locking in because I know that in most scenarios, you're not going to find a guy at 6.3K who is on average or over 50% of the time going to end up with 19 points. And he has a shot realistically at 40.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. So I don't think it's the worst thing, but I'm with you. You sold me a little bit on Baker. We've already talked about Tannehill in the obvious setup there, right? That's the opposite side of that game. Everyone's on Lamar, opposite quarterback, works out quite often because they are correlated, as I've always talked about. And the idea of skipping over Henry and going with AJB, Corey Davis, Jonnu Smith, there's a lot of guys that you can go with as far as that goes. And then Trubisky, I think the big thing about Trubisky and why I brought it up with Baker earlier, and it ties in as we'll segue over here to wide receiver, is Allen Robinson. He's the much higher owned, but Miller is 3.3K and they're without Mooney. So what's any thoughts on being able to stack that up, or do you like it as a secondary, like Miller with your Michael Thomas or anything along those lines as far as Chicago goes?
I mean, it's Allen Robinson or Montgomery. Either one of them are fine, but New Orleans is obviously a tough offense. And people are bringing up that Thomas is coming back from an ankle injury. Yes, I get that. Yes, it's probably it could hinder him a little bit, but more than likely they were just resting him for a while because what do they have to play for? Green Bay was clearly going to get the number 1 seed. We could see that 3 weeks ago. That's the only seed that ends up with a first round bye. Yes, they could have ended up with a possibility of playing Seattle in the championship game and not playing at home, which would have been tough, but they knew that they could win without Thomas. They knew that they could win without anyone. They had a solid enough defense and a solid enough offense and Sean Payton where it didn't really matter a ton. So, like, I think that they mostly rested Thomas because they didn't need to play him. Like, they knew that there's a decent chance they were going to lose to Kansas City regardless. And so I just don't see him being limited that much. And apparently Vegas, the fact that the lines on Thomas, all the props are getting higher and higher as the day goes along. And in some, there's ridiculous juice at like minus 160, I think, over on BetMGM. Like everything's pointing towards him having a good day. He's been limited in practicing most of the week, so he should be fresh. He has enough of a connection with Brees where missing practice for several weeks and limited in practice this week is not going to affect him. It's in a dome. Do you know how many times last year Michael Thomas had less than 94 receiving yards in a dome or in New Orleans last year?
What's the number?
1 in the Minnesota game because they were rushing it later on, and the Minnesota ended up coming back, and it was a weird scenario. But that's the only time where he ended up with less than 94, and he still had 8 catches and 70 yards. So he has been absolutely ridiculous, averaging, I think, 120 yards per game last season in a dome with an average of 8.5 receptions and 0.8 or 0.9 receiving touchdowns. That's just silly to me. And I don't care what his ownership is going to be. I still think it's going to be too low. So if I'm going to get Michael Thomas at 35% ownership, all I have to do is triple the field essentially and lock him in.
Yeah, it's pushing 40%, but I was going to say, I think the ownership number we have here is correct. I don't know if that's a correct move on the field. I think it should be more, possibly at 6.3K for this guy, like you mentioned, hence why you're locking him in. You're going 100% on enough lineups to matter. That's where I'm at as well. At 6.3K, it's just too cheap. I think, like you said, the perfect point there was that they've been saving him, right? Yes, he's nursing it a little, I'm sure, but guys can come out and play. And it wasn't yesterday, wasn't the greatest example, but the week before, McLaurin was coming off an injury, came out and got 7 for 40 and a touchdown. These guys can play through it. It's win or you're out. It's the playoffs. They're here to get it done. I think that's a great call. We've talked a little bit about guys like A.J. Brown, Robinson. They're up there. Their ownership's still up there a little bit, but they're not the situation like we had yesterday where the most expensive wide receiver is also the highest owned. We've got Michael Thomas at such a discount that's where the ownership is going. Moving in a different direction for a second here, Grant, talk to me about this Pittsburgh core, because how do you pick Deontay, Juju, Claypool? Who's it going to be? Or I mean, you're running those Baker Mayfield stacks. Obviously, you're running it back at some point. Who's the favorites for you? Or if you had to rank them, how would you go about it?
I mean, it's not even remotely close. It's Johnson is number 1. Juju is last. Like Deontay Johnson and Juju, close to the same price range, and they're projected for the exact same ownership. Games where Ben has played, and Deontay Johnson has not gotten injured, the dude is averaging 12 targets, 13 targets a game. He had so many games early on in the season where he plays 1-2 drive. All right, I'm out with an injury. But he has 12 games of over 10 targets. You don't see that from anyone outside of Michael Thomas and Devonta Adams over the last 2 seasons. It's just silly how much work he's getting. So this is mostly DraftKings oriented, but he's a guy that I'm going to have probably close to 70% in because he's too cheap. He makes things work. He's the same ownership as Juju. There's no reason not to go with him. But Claypool is the guy that offers you the most upside. Yes, Juju has shown a bit of upside. Yes, he's had some decent games recently, one of which was when Roethlisberger wasn't even starting. But he also has those games where he just doesn't do a ton. He does a lot of short 8-out passes, which I get Deontay Johnson does too. But Claypool has huge touchdown equity. Johnson has huge target equity. So using either one of those where you get Claypool lower ownership and Deontay at a massive price savings, those are the 2 guys I want to go with. I'm probably not going to play almost any Juju at all.
Okay. And I lean with you there, everything you were mentioning. So Deontay on DraftKings, to me, especially cash games, high dollar single entry, whatever, the opportunities, the amount of targets, things like that he gets, plus the opportunity to get in the end zone are all right there at 6.2K, especially over Juju. Like you say, that money is not worth as much when the ownership goes with it. I think Claypool's fine for both sites. I mentioned liking him quite a bit in the secondary stacks with Hunt and Claypool. That's huge separation or differentiation in your lineups alone in a correlated back and forth that makes sense, and both have the opportunity to get in the end zone twice or more just based on how their teams go about things. Yet everyone will tell you it's all like Deontay and Chubb. Yes, that looks better on paper, but Hunt and Claypool absolutely can do the same thing, if not more. And like you said, the ownership discount is massive. So I do like that. Claypool, they were still targeting him quite a bit last week, trying to get him in the end zone. And then of course he had that 4 touchdown breakout game earlier in the season, ton of touchdowns for a rookie. I'm a little bit biased because he's Canadian, love the nickname Mapletron. So 5.2K.
Everyone loves that nickname.
It's incredible. And I think it's just awesome to watch him out there. And at 5.2K versus Juju 5.5, Juju's going to collect these few catches here and there, but I'm still going to side with Claypool because it only takes one, and then it's a 40-yard chunk play, and then a 20-yard touchdown and stuff like that you'll see go in there. Any love for Emmanuel Sanders or Callaway for the New Orleans side? I know you've got so much Thomas. Think outside of what your ownership and perspective is, ways that they can get there, maybe for others in the chat that are asking. Any thoughts on those guys as alternatives to Thomas?
I mean, I as alternatives to Thomas, no. Like I said, locking in Thomas, not overthinking things. It's real simple to me. Just play Thomas. But how do they end up getting there? Like, that means that Drew Brees is either throwing the ball a ton, and so you use Drew Brees, or that Kamara is not getting the same pass game work, and they kind of scheme to limit him a little bit. So the only two ways that they end up getting there are if Brees is having a heck of a game, or if Kamara is being limited. So the simple way to do it is every single lineup where you have either Sanders or Callaway, throw in Brees and just do a double stack, or in lineups where you don't have Alvin Kamara, because there's a lot of ways where Brees doesn't end up giving you slate winning upside, and yet Callaway or Sanders go off. So just set a rule up in Lineup HQ, since this is a Lineup HQ show, that if you're using Callaway or Sanders, you either need Brees in it or you need to not have Kamara in it. Again, the 48% owned running back. So that's how it ends up happening. So that's how I'm going to set it up and just only play those guys. Both of them are fine. Neither one of them are great, but both of them are fine. But Sanders can have a bit of upside, and he's coming in at low ownership. You have to differentiate a little bit. So I think that an interesting way to do it is have both Thomas and Sanders in a lineup without Drew Brees, knowing that both of them can get there over on DraftKings specifically, just based on reception upside and maybe a touchdown.
Yeah, and that's key on DraftKings, like you said, because of the full point PPR. I'm with you there. One interesting note, I was just messing around with some hand builds last night, was that Michael Thomas and Anthony Miller, who is right here at 3.3K as sort of the fill-in 26% owned cheap value play. That's one that I hate because the ownership, but I love because just the opportunity, and it's just so cheap, and a game setup that I think it's going to make it work. So it is what it is. It's just a guy I would plug in, especially in higher dollar cash games, things like that. But one interesting note for large field stuff is the exact same dollar amount 2v2 is Michael Thomas and Anthony Miller can be swapped for Robinson and for Callaway. And you're using the same game, you're flipping the sides and just going with that. They're the exact same dollar for dollar. It's just of note, nothing to go crazy with. I just think when I find ones like that, sometimes they're interesting. I know someone was plugging some PGA stuff earlier, and I find those in golf all the time as well, right? You're finding these two golfers at the top that everyone has as the shoe-ins, and there's two really good guys directly below them. It's more of a take on if Robinson could somehow beat Michael Thomas or hold weight and keep with him. That would be huge because the ownership of 40% on Thomas. And then could Callaway beat Anthony Miller? Absolutely. To me, it's just like not even close. It takes one play for either of them. The chalk getting there would be tough. I'm on Miller. I just look for ways in large field tournaments to get a little bit different. I think that was one. Is there any other guys you wanted to take a flyer on down here, Grant, before we move to tight end?
I mean,
we talked about Snead. Sorry to cut you off, but we did talk about Snead. I know. So just so people just arriving to the chat, but anybody else?
No, it's Snead, it's People Jones. Those are the two guys that I go with. Even Boykins is not the worst idea in the world, but not overly excited about a guy that is not going to get more than 3 targets.
Yeah. And we talked about the Tennessee guys already, guys. So they go with your Tannehill builds. They go off of your Henry builds. Couple questions then coming out of the chat. One is, and I'll ask one first because it kind of ties in. Do you want Henry and AJ Brown in lineups together with Tannehill?
No, I think that limits things a little bit. If I am doing that, then I would assume that Baltimore is going off, but you can't really play Tannehill and Lamar in the same lineup. That can't happen. So if I'm having AJ Brown and Henry in a lineup, I'm probably bringing it back with Lamar and Hollywood in every single one.
Okay. And then the next one is, what about using Chubb and Hunt in the same lineup? And then we'll move to tight end.
I don't know if that's worth it. It's definitely a distinct possibility that both of them can end up going off, but you need pretty much Kamara and Thomas on the other side, and assuming that's going to be a high-scoring game.
Yeah. Again, all in your build setup. You can do whatever you want. The blender, play whatever you want. You can do that. But the idea of making it Yeah,
Just play him.
Just play him. Just make sense of it, though, right? That's what it comes down to. If you're building that build, you're saying that I would probably throw Cleveland defense in there because you're setting it up for short fields, the ability for them to score often. That's not always what you have to do. The RB DST correlation secondary stack has not always been proven to be right, and people love to go there. It doesn't mean it's always going to work, but the idea of that setup to me says that that's sort of the story you're telling. Fittest gamers, throw some questions in there. We've got about 12 minutes left here. So going to go through tight end a little bit though, because I think today it's definitely a bigger picture than yesterday where it was kind of, you just got to pick one. We've got Mark Andrews at almost 30% Grant here at the top. Then there's some Jonnu Smith, Eric Ebron, Hooper, Komet, all these guys as we go down. Talk to me a little bit about your plays here at the tight end position.
Tight end's tough. Tight end's tough to figure out. It's kind of whoever fits, but Jonnu's definitely my favorite. He's cheap. Like it's that simple. Everyone kind of blends together. I think the guy who probably is the best play at tight end because he's pretty close to a direct pivot from Jonnu is Jimmy Graham. I mean, it's not a whole lot of stats to back it up, but he does have 8 touchdowns on the season. It's a 6-game slate. There's not a ton of tight ends you can play. He's cheap. He makes things work. Like if anyone's going to go off for a decent game, and be at low ownership, it's not Njoku, most likely. It's not Ferkser. It's not Swan. It's not Troutman. Probably not Vance McDonald, although I could see him doing something. Maybe Harrison Bryant, but I don't think he's going to get enough work. It's most likely Jimmy Graham.
Yeah. And they tried him again last week. I played him last week because it was against Green Bay. I thought, the secondary revenge type thing, maybe we could see it, but they really did try. And just, they keep going to him. Everyone is going to play Komet over Jimmy Graham. Look at the delta on ownership. It's 1.6% versus
Where did
9.
Jimmy Graham play most of his career?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So it's I call it the secondary revenge last week, but exactly it. And now you're going to get him to go up here. So I think there's a possibility here, man. I like that call at 3.3K. I also think Jonnu getting the love at almost 20% is obvious in a sense because it's people that are going for the direct leverage off of Derrick Henry. But at the same time, how much have we seen him do? Like what you just mentioned with Graham for $100 more, and he's got touchdowns for days on the season. They are still targeting him down there. A lot of people are looking to squeeze in the middle with Cole Kmet, and then there's a lot of other guys around him. You mentioned Ferkser is a guy people could go to. Ebron, who I like. I think Ebron is interesting just because against Cleveland, there's a spot here where you could find them. Everyone wants to be on these receivers, which I will be too, as will you. We mentioned them in depth of going through Johnson, Claypool, then Juju. But I definitely think Ebron still gets some love here as well at 3.7K. Ben likes to look for him. It's an opportunity over that middle. I think there's going to be a chance here that we could see Ebron get in the end zone. He's a big body down there. Any love for Ebron? And then what about Austin Hooper, Jared Cook, guys that we didn't talk about?
I mean, I would love Ebron, but he's 15% owned. Like, he's fine. He's definitely got touchdown equity. Play him like if you're not playing Juju or Claypool. I think Deontay you can play regardless, but I wouldn't want to pair him up with some guys in that lineup. Hooper, he could end up with pretty massive target. We've seen Pittsburgh at random time just let huge games to opposing tight ends because they don't really scheme against them. But that's been more in the past few years. It's been a little bit less so this year. So Hooper's fine. Like, they're all fine. None of them stand off the page. Like, all the 3K tight ends that are going to be moderately chalk, Hooper, Ebron, and Jonnu, all have their pluses, all have their minuses. They're all priced a little bit too cheap. Like, play any one of them. Play them stack specific, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, we like putting our tight end with our quarterback. It seems to be the best way to go about it, especially when you're punting it off. Or just completely punt it and then jam everybody else into your lineup. So I don't mind that as well. We will move to some of the questions here, Grant, just to get through some of them. But, let's see. Defenses. Any Ds that you want to talk about?
I mean, obviously, the best one is probably the Steelers, just based on actual points. But play whichever one fits. Like, every single one of them is pretty close to a toss-up. It's the Saints and the Steelers that are probably the best ones, but they're most heavily priced. The difference in ownership between the top one and the bottom one is only 10%. So it's defense, it's volatile, just coin flip.
And it's funny too because and I agree. And it's funny too that everyone's just putting the Titans because they can punt it off and fit as much possible into their lineups, even though they're likely to have that against Lamar. Again, I talked about this yesterday. You can have three guys against your defense on a 3-game slate. It really doesn't matter. It just depends on what the rest of the build does and tells the story of it. But it's interesting because, yeah, they're 2.2K. It just makes everything else fit. Let's see what else we got here. Any thoughts on fading the first game completely and then just leaving some open lineups for the back end and just getting off? Because I know it wouldn't have worked out yesterday if you tried doing that with Buffalo and Indy. But what
not going to work
today?
out today. They've got like what, a 54 over under, and like fading the first game entirely is a horrible idea. Someone will be from that game on the tournament winning lineup, especially considering the two lowest implied team totals on the slate are both in the later games. So do not fade it entirely. Even if you just throw in Derrick Henry or AJ Brown or Hollywood Brown, like throw one player in from probably both sides. Like I have the rule set up where I have to have a minimum of one of both Baltimore and Tennessee. Like there's going to be someone that ends up going off there. It's not even up for debate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Another good question here too. Going with Lamar Jackson, Hollywood Brown, and Andrews in a lineup, 10 lineups. Would you want to have Henry in all 10 coming back the other way?
I mean, not necessarily. We've seen multiple games with the Titans so far this season where with that scenario, you assume that Baltimore is forced to throw later on in the game. But we've seen multiple games where they're still hammering Henry or they're just passing the ball. Like any number of things can happen. This Tennessee offense is very different than any other offense in the NFL. So you can throw anyone you want, AJ Brown or Corey Davis or Jonnu Smith or Derrick Henry in on the other side if you're playing those three guys.
Yeah, I would do the exact same thing. And I would take your stance there, Fittest. I would say basically what you're setting up is the story of, okay, let's say Tennessee gets out to 2 quick touchdowns and they're both Henry. Then Lamar has to come back with those guys the whole game. But that's just one opportunity. What if the Ravens go up 21-0 or 14-0 on a touchdown to both of those guys? And now maybe Henry's not as involved as much. So you want some AJ Brown, Corey Davis, Jonnu Smith coming back the other way. So if Henry's your biggest conviction, maybe use them on 5 or 6 and then build the other ones accordingly with another guy coming back. Quick question, Grant, favorite over underplay today? What's your favorite total and side?
I don't really have one on today's slate. It could probably be Cleveland +6. Probably the over on the New Orleans game, but my spreads and totals are not where I'm going. Like I've gone majority player props today, like over on Michael Thomas of 5.5 receptions, over of 70 yards on Michael Thomas, and over 3.5 receptions on Hollywood Brown. But I got all those at like -112 or -120, and they're all around -150 to -180.
Yeah, I like that. I'm with you on the Chicago New Orleans game. I think could be interesting. I like the over there. What else did we got here? So on FanDuel, if you have a lineup without Lamar, could you get away with Dobbins and Edwards on the same lineup and just hope they get all the touchdowns? I think you could. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different ways this game can end up going. There's no real strategy in that game for playing guys that it doesn't have a possibility of working.
Yeah, Alex, my guy, over-unders are sharp today. I agree. It's extremely tough to pick through them. Like Grant said, I'm with you, man, on the props. Let's get after those. We feel very comfortable about them. I know most people say limits and stuff, but most people aren't putting enough to where they're going to be capped out on them. So play these props, man. Take advantage. There's a lot of different sites right now. I know producer Devin was talking about some stuff before the show. Sometimes they'll even give you a nice little boost for hopping on a site and getting on there, right? Just for setting it up. So I like that. Tight end at a flex today. Another good question. I think that's interesting. What are your thoughts on that one?
Actually, like realistically, there's enough decent 3K tight ends. I almost always hate that strategy, but any one of Jonnu Smith, Ebron, Hooper can outscore Peoples-Jones, Miller, or any of those guys.
Yeah, and you took the words out of my mouth. I normally hate all of that things, but on 3-game slate, I think it's okay. And also because, like I said, it was tough pickings when it's Peoples-Jones, Anthony Miller, and Marquez Callaway for your punt plays when you've got a guy like you just mentioned, like Jonnu Smith or your Jimmy Graham call, I think is actually great. And I think Jimmy Graham across from Michael Thomas, talk about another great secondary stack. How often can you use a 6.3K Michael Thomas in a secondary stack and just get to crush with it? So I like that one quite a bit. You mentioned it earlier about Kamara and Thomas in the same lineups. And then what about Dobbins over 74.5 rush yards prop?
No, I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm thinking that
No,
line's about right.
I'm not a huge fan of that either, actually. You know, I think, like you said, there's just too many mouths to feed there. Look at the Lamar prop, because Lamar, even in a loss, could just go off here. He's done it a couple times against these Titans.
One of the props I bet on too is Lamar over 1.5 passing touchdowns. I mean, Tennessee's one of the worst pass defenses in the league, and you're getting plus odds on it.
Yeah, it's the books looking at it as the way, and even I think the general public looks at it like the Ravens run, right? That's their MO. Yeah. That's all they're going to do, but that's just not the case. And Lamar has got a little bit better. I know it's always a talking point or a soft spot about his accuracy and whatnot, but listen, he's trying his best out there. He's doing his thing. He could definitely throw some touchdowns here. 2 alone could go to Mark Andrews, or 1 to him and 1 to Hollywood. So I think that's interesting. And then a last question before we get out of here. Any tips for single entry tournaments on DraftKings? And we'll move on.
Fade Henry, fade Kamara.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious if you go look here, just the ownership's right at the top, 51 and 47%, guys. I wish we could get to all of the questions. Keep throwing them in there. We got another show coming up after this that you guys can stay tuned for. Get your questions in there. Appreciate all of your support. As always, Grant, man, always a fun time having you on here, man. Thanks for all of your insight. Other than that, thank you guys and good luck.
Thank you.
Wildcard weekend is here, and I'm back with 6 of my favorite plays on FanDuel and DraftKings, including some guys I think are underpriced, some guys I think have some big ceilings here. And what quarterback am I locking in? Not named Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. Belly up to the fantasy bar and find out. Welcome in, guys. Wild Card Weekend edition here. Beers Daily Fantasy 6-pack. Good to be back here once again in the Fantasy Bar, providing you 6 guys fresh off the tap on both FanDuel and DraftKings. Thank you, as always, for stopping by the Fantasy Bar. Now, before we get into the plays for Wild Card Weekend, guys, do me a favor. Click that thumbs up button. It means a lot. It helps us out tremendously here at Rotogrinders. So if you enjoy the video, you enjoy hanging out at the Fantasy Bar, that is all I ask in return. These videos are free, and I greatly appreciate the support there with the thumbs up. So, challenging you guys. Let's see how many we can get. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel and get notified when these videos are coming out. Now, before we jump into the playoffs, let's take a quick look back at our final week of the regular season in Week 17, and a so-so week. You know, we had some spots that were not so great. Tunyon found the end zone, didn't do much. Corey Davis kind of quiet. Kiki Cutie was all right, but hit it big with our running backs and Deshaun Watson, all producing well above their prices. So we will turn the page here to the playoffs. I know the sites have things divided into 3 and 3, but there are some 6 full game slates you can play as well. Regardless, I like these guys in all formats. However, you are playing the NFL playoffs. Let's start at the wide receiver position. Guy I think has a massive ceiling. That's Chase Claypool of the Steelers. Now, the Steelers receivers, one of those things we always debate. Deontay Johnson, clearly the safest, a guy getting a bunch of targets. Juju, banged up, dealing with a knee injury, did not practice on Thursday as of this recording. So that may lead to even more opportunities. But even if he's in there, I still like Chase Claypool. He's getting targets in this offense. We know they love to throw the ball. 8 or more targets now in 7 of the last 10 games. Been very good against this Cleveland team, including last week in Week 17. Even with a backup quarterback, Chase Claypool did well, averaging over 21 DraftKings points a game against Cleveland this season. And we mentioned the ceiling. I want guys that can give me a massive output and greatly outproduce their salaries. And Claypool, one of those guys. And if Juju's in there, he is the cheapest of the 3 on both sites this weekend. So a lot of chatter out there. They're really going to unleash Chase Claypool here in the playoffs. To me, that's only the icing on top. Whether it's true or not, I don't really care. I've seen this guy do it. I know he can do it. This Browns defense is dealing with a lot of injuries. This team's dealing with a lot of COVID issues. I think Pittsburgh rolls here, and I think a big reason why is Chase Claypool here to lead us off in the mid-range. All right, let's go to the running back position. This one not going to be for everybody. We're going to go cheap here with Gus Edwards of the Ravens. Now, I get it. J.K. Dobbins, the big name, the sexy new toys, it says in the graphics. in that backfield. You also have Mark Ingram there back in action last week. But I think Gus Edwards is going to be the forgotten man here. First of all, a lot cheaper, only $4,400 on DraftKings, under $6K on FanDuel. Does not need to do a ton to pay that price off. Ownership-wise, you're going to get a massive discount here on Gus Edwards. There's some running backs I think are going to be very highly owned on this slate. Guys like Akers, Carson. Edwards going to be a forgotten man, a great way to save some salary here. We got a massive total in this game. He's getting the workload as well, averaging almost 14 touches a game over the last 3 weeks of the season. You're thinking, 14 touches a game. At 4,400, at 5,700 on FanDuel, I'll take 14 touches a game any day of the week, especially against the Tennessee Titans. There was not a team in football that allowed more fantasy points to the running back position than the Tennessee Titans. So a great matchup, low ownership, and a cheap price. Add it all up, Gus Edwards, a great play this weekend across the DFS industry. All right, let's go to the tight end position. We're going to spend up as far as the position goes, but still pretty cheap here with Logan Thomas of Washington. Now, Washington, we know, big underdogs here in this game against Tampa Bay. You look at the passing game, and it's basically Terry McLaurin, the running backs a little bit, but it's a lot of Logan Thomas here as well, and it's kind of shown in the numbers. 10 targets per game over the last 5 weeks, a big 50 targets there for the math challenge for Logan Thomas. Double-digit DraftKings points, as you kind of expect with all those targets, but he's done that now in 9 of the last 11 games. So this guy really starting to develop right before our eyes. And when we look at that Tampa defense, we know they're very good against the run. They're not good against the tight end position. Bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed over the last 4 weeks and over the course of the entire season as well. So vulnerable in that spot. Washington probably throwing a ton. I don't care if it's Alex Smith, Tyler Heineke, does not matter to me. Logan Thomas, a big part of this offense, going to be a big part of my wild card builds here on both sides. All right, let's go to the running back position and spend some money this time. We're going to go right back to the well on Jonathan Taylor of the Colts. And this is another one I don't think is going to be for everybody. I think a lot of people expecting Buffalo to roll in this game. I think the Colts are good enough to keep this game close. And the way they do that is through Jonathan Taylor. Now, you got to pay up for him. No doubt here in this matchup. Generally, I don't like running backs as road underdogs here, but I love the matchup here with Buffalo. Over the last 4 weeks, Buffalo has allowed the most fantasy points to the running back position. We know over the course of the season, they have not been good against this position as well. So I think you're going to see a heavy dose of Jonathan Taylor in this matchup with Buffalo. And the ownership, a lot lower than I expected it to be. I expected Jonathan Taylor to be one of the highest owned running backs, and maybe we get to that point once these games kick off, but initial run has him down the list a little bit. So highly encouraged by that he's not going to be heavily owned. Plus, played a ton of snaps, 84%, a season high in snaps last week against Jacksonville. Sure, this game could get away from them. You see a lot of Nyheim Hines, but again, I think they keep this game close. It's under a touchdown on the line, so we're not expecting a blowout here and can be involved in the passing game. Jonathan Taylor playing too well against an awful Buffalo run D. All right, back to the mid-range, back to a ceiling play at the wide receiver position. Another Raven for us, Marquise Hollywood Brown. Now, do you want Brown, Edwards in the same lineup? Maybe not. I don't hate it in a game stack, but the point is I like Brown here as well, so wanted to make sure I got him in the six-pack. First of all, pricing. He's all the way down to $5,400 on DraftKings. We look back, we got to go all the way back to week 12 in a tough matchup against Pittsburgh to find a cheaper price on Hollywood Brown. The touchdowns, been there as well, was kind of quiet to open the season, but 6 touchdowns now in the last 6 games for Hollywood Brown. And what a matchup this is for touchdowns, for wide receiver production, however you want to look at it. The Tennessee Titans, not very good defensively, awful against wide receivers, and allowed the 3rd most touchdowns to that position, 22 on the season. Again, Hollywood Brown, a huge upside play at a very cheap mid-range price on both FanDuel and DraftKings. All right, it's time to take a look at my favorite play for Wild Card Weekend. But before we do that, as always, we're going to continue our Beast of the Week contest, absolutely free to play. All you got to do, get in the comment section right below the video and give me fantasy points on FanDuel for my favorite play. The closest guess will win themselves a free week of Rotogrinders Premium or a free Rotogrinders t-shirt. Without further ado, let's wrap up Wild Card Weekend. My favorite play, you know him as the Beast of the Week. All right, Beast, time I owe you a quarterback. We said it will not be Josh Allen. It will not be Lamar Jackson. We're going to go back to that Ravens-Titans game with Ryan Tannehill, this week's Beast of the Week. Now, let me be clear. I have no issues with Josh Allen, with Lamar Jackson. We know those are the two highest projected quarterbacks here. We know the ceilings that those guys possess. But I'm going to save a little bit here and go with Ryan Tannehill for a lot of different reasons. First of all, we talked about the high total in this game, the highest total we have on the board here. We talked about the Titans being underdogs in this game. That could lead to more passing opportunities. I know they want to run everything through Derrick Henry. They may not be able to do that here in this game again.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another fun day of NFL action right here on Rotogrinders. Welcome to Crunch Time. I'm the Luch. I got Dan with me here, producer Devin. What's going on, Dan?
Not much. We were talking pre-show. We like these 3-game slates, so I'm just getting excited for the 3-game slate. Think we should have a little bit more exciting games today, although yesterday wasn't too bad.
Yeah, not too bad. There's always something every slate, right? So a lot of talk was, hey, you can probably get a little contrarian in that late game. I was super happy that I got Mike Evans really low. He played all right. It's tough to figure out where the ball goes there, but the Ronald Jones thing, wow, he was very chalky, and I think we can all agree that we can only hope that everything's a little more cut and dry and maybe no surprises like that late, because I don't know. I mean, the pricing seems a little more friendly for me just as a first glance, and that late game, you have 3 very talented receivers. We'll get there eventually. If you'd rather go position by position or game by game, you tell me. But, there's some magic in that late game, I think, despite all of the things the Browns are going through right now. So how do you want to attack this, Dan? You want to talk position or talk game? I'll leave it up to you, and then we'll roll with it.
We can go game by game if you want.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I feel like, Lamar coming in at highest owned quarterback and rightfully so. Would you agree that he probably has the highest upside on the slate today?
Yeah, I think pretty easily. Although it's interesting, if you run, I think projections aren't going to necessarily jam him in. The projections that I'm using doesn't use him in like DraftKings optimals because he's actually kind of expensive there and is a pretty big price difference between like Lamar and Roethlisberger on DraftKings. But man, it's hard for me to get away from Lamar on this slate, even on DraftKings. And I do like pairing him with both Andrews and Hollywood as well. This Tennessee defense is just so bad. It's hard not to stack up on Baltimore on this slate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're not looking at like a 2008 slugfest or Baltimore, Tennessee have played each other so many times since I've been alive and in the playoffs. And this is, Tennessee's going to have to win on the offensive side of the football unless we see something different. But at this point, you can't really bank on it. Tennessee's either dead last or second last in quarterback sacks. And, when you have a guy that can shift around as much as Lamar, that's definitely troubling. I think it's fascinating that Mark Ingram finally got phased out. It took 17 weeks basically for Ingram to basically not be a thing, but here we are. And J.K. Dobbins, I guess, finally had his breakthrough coming out party, you could say, in the final week of the regular season. Still didn't have a ton of touches. I'm waiting on maybe a 20 touch game one day in some fantasy land I live in, I guess. But he's fairly priced, and I'm actually a little surprised that he's – let me see what his ownership is on DK. I looked at it before, and I guess I was a little surprised that he is only 17%, and maybe it's a volume thing. I don't know, but I think he's a decent candidate to potentially score twice in a kind of maybe a shootout type environment. So that was kind of my initial reaction. And of course, we'll talk about some of these chalk running backs, and we'll talk about the guy on the other side of the ball, Derrick Henry. But do you have any interest in either Gus Edwards or Dobbins? I'll quickly say Edwards isn't sexy, but I also don't think he'll completely bust at 4,400. He gets involved one way or another. He might even vulture, a touchdown here or there. And if he gets in, you're golden at 4,400. So what are your thoughts in that Baltimore backfield of another very run-heavy offense there?
Yeah, I think the Dobbins ownership thing on DraftKings is almost just entirely because of his price point. Like he's in that 6,600 range, or he is 6,600. I think people will play Montgomery over him in that range. People might even play Chubb in that range over him. And then if you're not playing someone there, you're probably going down to like a James Conner, which sounds disgusting, but I think Conner, because of his price, is actually going to see some decent ownership and definitely be higher owned than Dobbins. So I think Dobbins makes for an excellent tournament play on DraftKings, just considering what his price or we have his projected ownership at. I will say he still has we know he has pass catching ability, but he hasn't really shown any upside in that area. So I do think if I'm playing Dobbins, I would rather just not pair him with Lamar. I would use it as leverage off Lamar. That would be on both sides too, DraftKings and FanDuel. Although FanDuel, let's see, I think we had his ownership at over around 23% on FanDuel. I do think Dobbins will be higher owned on FanDuel just because he's a lot easier to kind of work into your lineups there. But then, nobody likes Gus. Nobody likes playing Gus, but he's been good. If he gets a touchdown or two, like you said, he could easily work his way into optimal lineups on a slate like this. So similar story with him, though. If you're playing Gus Edwards, you're not pairing him with Lamar. Could theoretically both guys get there and be in optimal lineups? Yes, but it's just not the high probability outcome.
I agree. And that being said, on the flip of the bill, I worry about correlating a little less on 3-gamers, definitely on 2-gamers, but I think you're right. Edwards, much like Dobbins, provides leverage, from Lamar. When they get inside that 5-10 yard line, it's likely going to be one of them, or maybe you get a little bloop over the top to Mark Andrews or something like that. But other than that, they don't have a ton of other tricks in that tool bag, what they do when they get inside the 10 yard line. You mentioned Andrews and Hollywood Brown, and people were really ripping Hollywood in the first half of the season, rightfully so. He was downright bad. And additionally, Lamar was kind of missing him on some deep shots too. He really had a bunch of air yards. It was a little deceiving. I don't think it was totally, Hollywood's fault per se that he just wasn't producing. And now he gets a Titans team who can't figure out a way to dial up pressure unless, like I said, unless we see something different, which I at this point, you can't really say that. We saw against the Texans last week, Tennessee was kind of holding Houston in check, but then late in the game, they let Kiki behind them for a bomb, and then Brandon Cook snuck back there. So it's like, come on, man. But when you get another speedster in there like Hollywood, another, Ravens are play action, kind of read option type offense himself. I like that call there. What kind of build? It sounds like you like a lot of guys in this game, and as do I, rightfully so. I think it's the highest total on the board. So what kind of build? Who do you run? Do you run this back with somebody? What are your initial thoughts on kind of a construction here?
So I'm thinking the chalky build on DraftKings in general of cash games, even I think tournament shells from this game, it's going to be Lamar, Marquise Brown, Mark Andrews, and bring it back with Corey Davis because Corey Davis is so cheap on DraftKings. That's what I like though too. If I'm differentiating from that in personal lineups, I'm just possibly not bringing a bring back option and hoping Baltimore kind of just smashes. But I think if you go, I'd be interested to see here what we have for ownership projection on DraftKings. Yeah, see, we have Corey Davis, 32.6% projected ownership, and then AJ Brown below him, just because of the price difference. Again, I would maybe bring it back with AJ Brown if you're trying to get a little bit different, just because I do think Corey Davis just works so naturally in all the lineup builds that that's going to be a common build, whereas AJ Brown does not fit naturally at all.
Right. And I think maybe AJ may come in a little lower than maybe that 26 as well. There's a ton of options. You'll get Allen Robinson and Michael Thomas in that later game, both in that kind of 6K range. I think maybe some people will just slide to them, figure, well, those guys will probably see the volume. Where's it going to go in Tennessee? But that Titans offense, I will say, we've seen it all year. The target tree and the volume and the opportunities are between those three people generally in AJ, Corey Davis, and Derrick Henry. We haven't seen Adam Humphries healthy for a while. Jonnu Smith is kind of just a red zone guy at this point for whatever reason, and he was hurt for a while too. So I do kind of like AJ Brown for GPPs. You know, Baltimore is a heavy blitzing man coverage type team, and you know, I like, you know, AJ Brown is that unicorn. He's the yak guy. He doesn't make sense really ever, right? But he always seems to have that run after a catch play or something that gets there. And I do believe Corey Davis actually has more 100-yard games than we've seen from AJ Brown this year too. So that is definitely interesting. And, you know, Davis's price is very friendly on this slate as well, like you said. And I think we'll see him in a lot of opto bills and cash things like that. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Crunch Time Discord. Dan and I will answer as much as we can, and we'll give you our thoughts. We're about 20-25 minutes tops before kickoff here of Sunday wild card weekend, talking about Baltimore and Tennessee right now. And Mark Andrews, you mentioned him too, and DK we have him projected as the highest owned tight end, rightfully so. He's also the most expensive tight end, and the last couple of weeks his target shares have really increased. He saw an 11 target game against the Giants in week 16, which was a career high, by the way. He's never seen a game with double-digit targets. And when you run the ball 50 to 75 times a game, I'm just kidding, as Baltimore is, you know, that's an incredible amount of volume for someone on Baltimore to see. So, you know, I guess you could label Mark Andrews as kind of their possession guy, because you have Hollywood Brown, who, you know, high A speedster, drops the ball a lot too. I did see Willie Snead is active today, you know, another non-sexy name who will probably be, I would assume, minimally owned. Let me see what we have him here in DK, but just worth noting that guy always seems to, you know, poke his head up there once in a while in the red zone with like a 2-catch, 20 yards and a touchdown game. Yeah, Willie Snead projected just under 2%. So if you're looking for like a mega punt, I can't really endorse you playing him in something optimal or higher stakes, but I mean, you know, he's going to be on the field quite a bit, and you know, 3,500 is certainly interesting. So, any other thoughts on that, you know, Titans-Ravens game? And, you know, I guess my last thing here is we have to pick a defense somewhere, and, you know, we know defense and DFS is so much about getting those turnovers. You know, we saw the Rams pick 6 yesterday, be on pretty much all of the tournament takedown teams. So is there any chaos potential in this game? I mean, can you punt Tennessee's defense even if they gave up 30 points in some builds or something like that?
It's a little tough on this slate specifically. I mean, I don't mind Baltimore's defense, but this slate specifically, you have Pittsburgh and New Orleans defense, both at just tremendous spots. I typically don't like force in a defense if on DraftKings or FanDuel. Like, I don't try, like, I just let that be the last piece of the puzzle for me, defense typically. But on this slate, I do think there is a pretty big difference. With that said, defense is so random. Like, yes, New Orleans and Pittsburgh are probably going to be the two teams that have the most opportunities for turnovers, but they might not capitalize on that. And if we get a random DST touchdown out of Tennessee, then they're probably going to be in the optimal lineup. So I'm not doing it a ton, but I have no qualms with anybody doing it. I do have something to say about Andrews. I brought up the YouTube chat, and that's a lot more active than our Discord. I went to Discord first, and we don't have a lot going on there. But YouTube chat, we have some questions, and one was on Mark Andrews, who we had, who you were talking about a little bit. And the question was, can you play Dobbins and Andrews in the same lineup on DK GPP? And I think you absolutely can. And I think that's another good way to get leverage off of Lamar, because Andrews has seen some volume, but he's also kind of the touchdown guy too. So, you know, you get 2 touchdowns out of Mark Andrews, you get 2 touchdowns out of JK, and you're looking really good to start the day as leverage off of Lamar. So I think you can absolutely do that.
No, I agree. You know, 2 teams where you typically know where the ball is going, which is really nice. After yesterday, you have the Rams, and, you know, the Rams are a team where we don't really know what the hell is happening from week to week. And plus, you know, Goff's not a big volume guy, so it's tough between Kupp and Woods. And for much of the year, we had to deal with that 3-headed monster in the backfield. And it's really nice that Cam Akers is finally, or I should say maybe Sean McVay has allowed Cam Akers to spearhead that role finally, and, you know, big game by him. So, you know, Baltimore, we typically know where the playmaking is going to come from. It's just a matter of, you know, script and what's actually going to happen here. Got a question in our Discord chat here before we get to Derrick Henry, the elephant in the room. In DK Cash, if you already have Anthony Miller, I'm assuming, and you run a second Bears player, Do you prefer Montgomery or Robinson?
If it's flex, I would probably go Robinson.
Yeah, I'm probably with you there too. We will get there, momentarily when we talk about that game. The next question is an obvious one. So is Henry a core today for cash? And let's talk Derrick Henry. We're not getting out of here without talking some big dog here, Derrick Henry. Cash, GPP, what are your thoughts, and what kind of bills does he belong in, Dan?
I think I'm playing Kamara over Derrick Henry. Definitely on DraftKings. FanDuel, you can work in Henry a little bit more there. I think Henry's a fine play. I'm ready to be rabbit. Like, I'm ready for the fade to not pay off and just get killed by it. But he's tough to fit builds. The 700 does help a lot on DraftKings. Yeah, I mean, Henry's a fine play in all formats. I'm not going to call him a bad play, but he's somebody that I don't have a ton of exposure to, just because I think Alvin Kamara projects fairly similarly and offers a pretty good discount.
I like that call a lot, and I think you're going to see a lot of people try to force him in. I'm just looking at our projected DraftKings ownership at defense. The Titans are at the top of the list. It's not by a big margin, but they're coming in just over 20%. The Steelers and Saints are right there, around 20%. And then there's a drop off to the other three defenses on the slate. So I think you make a good point. That salary does make a big difference. If you're stuck in the 6 to 7K range in receivers, that kind of helps you get your player of choice or something like that as well. And, the Bears are stingy against the run, but I like the Saints. They're inside. Kamara can get it done, catching the ball out of the backfield as well, which is something we haven't seen from Derrick Henry this year either. So I'm with you there. I think, FanDuel, I do like the Henry call, because when the ball gets inside the 10-yard line or something like that, you typically know where it's going. But one more thing I do want to add in there is with this game as a whole, I do like Ryan Tannehill for tournaments. He's coming in at under 10% on DraftKings. And don't look now, but he kind of has some rushing upside now. The last 3 weeks, he has 5 rushing touchdowns. It's kind of like, well, everybody knows the ball's going to Henry, and he's been keeping some of this RPO stuff we've seen more and more. He's had at least 20 rushing yards in each of the last 3 games as well. And I just think there has to be some more unscripted stuff. Tannehill is going to have to do quite a bit for Tennessee to try and come out with a win, I think. And I think you're going to see him use his legs a little bit more with kind of laying everything out there on the table. So I think Tannehill, if you're looking for tournaments, we talked about Corey Davis, and if Tannehill throws a touchdown to Corey Davis, and maybe he runs 2 touchdowns and he has 2 rushing touchdowns in 2 of his last 3 games, and then I think you're in a decent spot there as well. So I think Tannehill is interesting to keep an eye on. Anything before we move on to the Saints and the Bears?
No, I think we got mostly everything. There is a question I see in YouTube chat. I think that's relevant, not necessarily to that game, but lineup construction as a whole on DraftKings about, can you use, tight end in the flex, basically 2 tight end builds. Most slates, I would give it the old nah wave and say, no, don't do that. But I do think it is fine construction on a slate like this, whether you're playing Jonnu Smith and Mark Andrews, or Eric Ebron is another option that's pretty cheap. I do think you can do 2 tight end builds on this slate, mainly because I think a lot of the tight end options project just as well or better than a lot of the value wide receiver options.
Good call. Let's move on here. Saints in Chicago. And we have some Anthony Miller mentions and things like that. I guess the big news there is Darnell Mooney is not playing. And boy, oh boy, did he see quite the target increase the last 5-6 weeks of the season. He had 13 in week 17. And then he had 12 combined the previous 2 weeks. So there is a void there for sure. On the flip side, Cole Kmet has also got a lot more involved in the offense, somebody who really hasn't. And his numbers haven't really showed for it, but I'm looking at his target since week 13, 7, 7, 2, 6, 8. So the opportunity is going to be there for Cole Kmet. He's very cheap. You just talked about tight ends, and that's the guy who I think could help you get to where you want to go roster-wise as well. So I guess, we can start on the Bears side of the ball, since they've been a lot of chatter about them the last couple of weeks. Matt Nagy finally gives up play calling duties and the Bears are more productive. I don't know if that's coincidental or not. You tell me. But anyway, David Montgomery has probably been the fantasy story of the second half at running back, and just the incredible volume he's been seeing. They've been able to win games with giving him that volume. Now they got a tough matchup. And, I'm taking this into consideration a little more than I typically would. I know it's all about opportunities, but they kind of had a cakewalk schedule the last 5 to 6 weeks. The Saints are very good against the run typically. So I'm just thinking out loud here. Are we going to see 25 to 30 carries from David Montgomery again? I don't know. Maybe the game script won't allow that. So, he's been great. He's been a horse, but I'm really thinking about, fading him in GPPs and, if I'm playing in something large field here, although he's been very good. He's been very good. So what are your thoughts on that Bears side of the ball, Dan? Just kind of collective thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you. And I've actually had this argument with my buddies already this morning, in the sense that, like, Chicago might just not do anything offensively today. Like the second half of the schedule was ridiculously easy. They had Green Bay twice, Detroit, Houston, Minnesota, Jacksonville. So of course, like, the numbers look good for all these guys. Montgomery has seen a lot of involvement. That's the thing going for him. He's shown a lot of work as a pass catcher. That's the thing going for him. So, like, I'm fine playing these guys, but I also would not be surprised if the Bears put up 10 points. Like, it's hard to put up fantasy points if your team just goes 3 and out at every drive, which I think is a potential to happen here today. So the debate I was having with my buddies is, like, they wanted to play Brown's defense or punt defense to get up to Allen Robinson over Marquise Brown. And for me, it's like, I just want the guy on the team that's actually going to score points and move the ball. Like, I know Allen Robinson's the better player, hands down the better player. I know he's still going to get targets with this game trailing from behind, but it's like, I just don't trust the Bears to put any points up at all. And if that's not happening, then it's going to be hard for Allen Robinson to pay off his price tag where he's at. It's going to be hard for David Montgomery to pay off his price tag where he's at too. So in general, I don't like a lot of these Bears guys. The interesting guy is Anthony Miller. You can throw Javon Wims into the mix if you really want to get down and dirty with it and when you're multi-entering. The thing is, like, we've seen in the past, the Bears wide receiver 2 go down, and Anthony Miller does his role never changes. He's the slot guy here. So, like, if you play Anthony Miller and you turn the game on and he's not starting wide out and 2 wide receiver sets, like, don't get mad. That's perfectly fine. That's what you expect. They're probably going to have to play more 3 wide receiver sets today because they're going to be playing from behind for most of the game. So Miller will be on the field. The target share has to go somewhere. So I don't think Miller's all that bad of a play, but I do think Javon Wims is probably the guy that's going to be playing in 2 wide receiver sets. Javon Wims is going to be the guy nobody has. He's probably not going to get the same amount of targets as Anthony Miller, even though Miller's going to play less snaps. I still think Miller probably has a little bit better target share. But I don't know. I don't think Miller's like some slam dunk play. I've seen a lot of people saying he's kind of the slam dunk value play. I don't necessarily think that. And I also don't necessarily think Javon Wims is just some total dust play either. So I like, if we're getting real cheap with it, you can take shots on those guys, but I wouldn't use them as kind of core pieces of my builds.
Love that analysis. I love the GPP call on Wims. I think Anthony Miller, if you're playing cash on a 3-game slate for whatever reason, I think he'll come in mega chalk probably. And you know how many times Anthony Miller has let me down in the past years? I'm just waiting for him to be good, right? Especially on those showdown slates. You're like, let's roll out Anthony Miller at 2%. What could go? Like, his upside's there. It just never happens. I'm not saying it can't be the day today, but I think he warrants a good GPP fade. You're right. And just talking about matchups, circling back here, using our Gridiron IQ tool here on Rotogrinders. Out of all these playoff teams, the Saints are second best in yielding rushing success plays. So they're second best according to a lot of our advanced metrics here against the run. They are second best in not allowing 10+ runs on the ground either. And I like the blown block metric here, showing, offensive, defensive lines here. And, blown blocks are where the big plays come in. So they're very good in terms of being disciplined in the gaps as well there too. So I think it might be tough sledding for David Montgomery. obviously, if they get, inside the 5-yard line, they're going to try to pound the football. If he gets a touchdown, it is what it is, but he's going to have to do a little bit more than just score once to kind of pay off that price tag. You're right. And it sounds like me and you are on the same page here. And it's funny because I've talked to a lot of people that are like, nah, I'm smashing David Montgomery in there. I'm like, go ahead. Like, one of us are going to be wrong. It is what it is. We'll move on. We'll wake up the next day and the sunshine will be out. It is what it is. But if, I'm more prone to play Allen Robinson, I guess not as a pivot off Montgomery, because Robinson's gonna carry ownership as well. But if I'm picking someone from that game, in terms of how I think it's gonna lay out between how stout New Orleans has been against the run, we talked about the cake schedule David Montgomery has had. Robinson's gonna get his 10 targets today, barring God forbid injury or something like that. So if I'm picking someone in that game, it's Robinson. And on the flip of the bill, we'll talk Alvin Kamara. Michael Thomas kind of worked his way back here. He's, I guess, fairly priced. So what are your thoughts on Michael Thomas? And of course, we'll get into Kamara and the rest of this team too.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas is interesting to me because I think he's gonna project as like the best point per dollar option on the slate, basically, just because when he plays, he gets a huge target share. So he's tough to pass up in cash game builds on both sides because he is too cheap for what he does in that offense. I think he's a fine tournament fade, and just hoping that his role is maybe a little bit less than what we initially expect with him. And then Kamara, like I said before, I'm probably playing him over Henry in most of my lineups. So I like him in cash games, GPPs, all that as well. Both guys are really good plays.
I agree. 5-6 years ago, we'd say Drew Brees at home in the dome, lock button. But here we are in 2021, and now people are calling him Noodle Arm on Twitter, and that's pretty sad. Here we are. But Brees under 6K, he's in play on this 3-gamer. I think he's coming in at under 20% on DK. He's projected our third highest owned quarterback here. So I know we talked a lot of Kamara, and I know we have to get going here. We're about 10 minutes before lock, and we have a big night game to talk about too, and maybe take some questions here. So what are your thoughts on Drew Brees? He's going to carry some decent ownership today, and people love punting Trubisky. So let me hear about the quarterbacks in this game from your perspective.
I don't like either very much. Brees would be the one. I don't think he has upside really, but like maybe he can get on the end of a few short touchdown passes, and that's enough to kind of be all right on this slate. But man, I watched, what was it? It must have been the Vikings game. I rostered Marquez Callaway that game, I remember, and I like the worst pass I've seen a professional quarterback make. Callaway had like 3 or 4 steps on the guy. It was only like a 20-30 yard throw, and Brees could not get it there. There are reports that he's feeling better, but like, what else are they going to say? Of course, the reports are going to be that he's feeling better. But yeah, I mean, whatever. Do it in tournaments if you want. Don't expect a lot. He doesn't have a ton of upside. Trubisky, we kind of did the same thing with him as Montgomery, right? They had like a really, really easy schedule, like a super, super, super easy schedule. And still in that stretch, he topped out at 24 fantasy points. So it's like, you can play him, but I wouldn't expect any sort of upside from him. He's somebody that I'm not really going to play.
Let me throw you a question or two before we hop into this last game here. There's an Anthony Miller question. We talked about Anthony Miller. He'll be highly owned, but he has a decent shot to do nothing like he typically does. But I think if you're playing cash games, I would probably play Anthony Miller in there on DK. Question for you: flex DK cash, James Conner or Corey Davis?
Man, I think it's Conner, which sounds crazy. He has shown a little bit more work as a pass catcher the last 2 weeks. I know last week was kind of a pointless game, so it is what it is. But he's shown at least some signs of life, and I do want exposure to this Pittsburgh offense. So I think Conner is the play.
One more, and then we'll get into the last game here. DK GPP, a 3v3. Gotta love these. Michael Thomas. I'm assuming Michael Thomas, Jonnu Smith, and the Steelers D, or Corey Davis, Marquise Brown, and the Bears. That's tough. If you're looking to correlate, I like Corey Davis and Marquise Brown together if you think it kind of shoots out there. So that's me for GPPs. I'll take Corey Davis and Marquise Brown, although, Michael Thomas, Jonnu Smith, I'm assuming in Steelers. Yeah, it's the second one for me, I think. One more. We'll segue into the last game here. DKGPP, Chubb or Kamara?
I would only be using Chubb in builds where it's like if you're gonna play Browns D, that type of build. Like Chubb could get game scripted out pretty quickly. He doesn't catch passes. If this game gets out of hand, he's not gonna be very heavily involved. And it's probably that's a good transition to the next game too, because like I'm worried about this Cleveland team. I'm worried about the Cleveland offense in general. I'm worried about their defense in general. I know the line's only like at 6 points, which is actually not too bad, but they got the COVID issues going around. Trying to find the list. I had a list here of who's out for them. Offensive. So something people overlook is when like coaches are missing due to COVID issues, but that makes way more of a difference than people realize. They're without their head coach, obviously, Kevin Stefanski. They're without offensive line coach, assistant offensive line coach, tight end coach, DB coach. Like this could be an absolute mess. People don't realize, like, just imagine taking half your coaching staff out, next week for a game. Like it's going to be much more chaotic than what you're used to. Decisions, the decision tree is all different than what it's used to be. It makes a big difference. I kind of think the Browns just get their shit kicked in tonight. Basically, I think they're going to get killed.
That's one of my favorite outcomes, especially if they can't run the ball. I mean,
yeah,
Baker's been good when they've been able to run the ball, but he's bad under pressure. You look at metrics, he is very bad under pressure. The Browns are also missing their longest tenured lineman, Joel Bitonio, so there's another key loss there. I mean, they're facing one of the best fronts, maybe the best front seven in football. So I think it's going to be tough sledding, especially for Nick Chubb. I am significantly underweight on Nick Chubb. I have more Kareem Hunt than Nick Chubb if he gets game scripted out. So I'm assuming maybe that would be a question popping in here. So I like Kareem Hunt on very large field GPP stuff because that's more of a PPR format. And I guess I have mild interest in Jarvis Landry for the same reasons you probably do, with just maybe them trailing very early and often. And I could be wrong. And if I am, but this is the way I made my builds. And Chubb's been phenomenal when he's been healthy, but this is not a good spot, especially with all of their issues. And it stems down from not having their coach, and there's play calling influences in the whole 9 yards. So you have to feel for the Browns after just obviously the story of their franchise the last X amount of years since the Dennis Northcutt days. I don't think they've had there's a name drop for you, appearance in the playoffs. But I think you're right. What do you do? Russian roulette on the other side of the ball with these Pittsburgh receivers, and then James Conner's carrying some ownership. And I got to tell you, I think one of my I don't know if I can label him a favorite play on today's slate, but I do like Eric Ebron. He's very, he's the weapon in the end zone. We've seen Ben Roethlisberger go to him from time to time. And if I'm not paying up, to get Mark Andrews on DK and I need to save $1,500, that gives me some flexibility. But there is a lot of mouths to feed there. Pittsburgh has looked really bad the second half until something clicked against the Colts and they made that crazy comeback. I watched an ESPN interview last week, and I don't remember who said it on the Steelers that someone on Indy was calling out the Pittsburgh plays in the first half. And then I think it was Juju, And then he said Roethlisberger was calling stuff at the line. We weren't practicing all weekend. Amazing difference there. I don't know what it is. You guys can do your own investigating there. But in terms of the receivers for Pittsburgh, Claypool is very cheap and he'll be very popular. And of course, you have Juju, but Deontay Johnson has been this volume guy all year. So I guess, do you have a pecking order there, or are you just kind of playing? Would you just rather play a stack and hope it's a slaughter?
Deontay, Chase, and then Juju is the third. Don't have any problem people playing Chase.
Anyway, the pit.
Oops.
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
You're good. Am I here now?
It probably is my connection. I live in the middle of nowhere. I got to go feed the hamsters so they keep spinning on the wheel out there. Go ahead. My bad, Dan.
No, you're good. I was just saying it's Deontay, then Chase for me. Juju's third. I like the Ebron call. I think he's an excellent option too. He's one of the reasons why I think playing two tight ends is completely fine on this slate, because I do think Ebron's an excellent play. But yeah, it's the same. FanDuel
GPP Flex from Muffin Man Dan in the Discord chat. Deontay versus Dobbins for FanDuel Flex.
I mean, it depends on format, right? And it depends a little bit on if this is GPP. It depends on your lineup construction. If this is GPP and you do not have Lamar Jackson as your quarterback, I would use J.K. Dobbins for sure. If this is cash and you have Lamar Jackson, I would probably go the other way.
I agree. And then a lot of these, pivots and swaps are tough without seeing the rest of the lineup because a lot of it is really predicting a game flow and a script and what you think is going to happen. But I agree with that analysis here. We are like 2 minutes away from Super Sunday here, Wild Card Weekend. Anything we didn't cover that you wanted to bring up or mention, or any kind of closing thoughts?
No, not really. I don't know. I'm just I'm excited for the Baltimore game to kick off. I think they're going to kill too. So I think some of these games might end up in blowouts, but I'm excited for it.
Yeah, same here. It's been a fun weekend. Make sure you pop in. There's a ton of showdown offerings on both sites. So, if you're drawing dead early, this showdown game type really changed the game for DraftKings and FanDuel single game, man. So there's always action. There's always people talking in our premium Discord. A lot of good camaraderie there. Our experts pop in, and we're there to help you out. And of course, there's NBA tonight and all the COVID issues they're dealing with as well. So personally, not really looking forward to figuring all that. I'll probably change up my stuff about 10 to 15 times and what I pick for NBA later. But we just hit locked in. So you know what? I'll put you on the spot before we get out of here. Tell me who's going to win outright in all 3 games. Who do you got?
We're going Baltimore, New Orleans, and Pittsburgh. I mean, I'm eating the chalk, but I like the spread in all those games too. The only game I don't like to cover is New Orleans. I would rather just take the under in that game.
Good stuff. Well, thanks for joining us today on NFL Crunch Time. For Dan and producer Devin, I am Justin Carlucci. Good luck, and we will see you next week.